Hello, welcome back. This is Professor Young, and we are about ready to embark on part 3 of 3 for the respiratory system. The slide before you is what we left off with during our last WIMBA session. That WIMBA session dealt primarily with what is happening specifically within the interface between the circulatory system and the respiratory system within the alveoli, and what is happening at the interface between the circulatory system and the tissue. In other words, what is happening in regards to oxygen loading and unloading, what is happening in regards to carbon dioxide loading and unloading. What we need to really focus in on during this WIMBA session is what is happening here. What is happening in the middle? How is oxygen getting from point A to point B? And how is carbon dioxide getting from point B back to point A? And so that is where we are heading during this session. And the answer really all comes down to hemoglobin. This is not our first time really looking at hemoglobin. We have spent some time before diving into hemoglobin. I think specifically we looked at it in chapter 18 when we were talking about the blood. And what we know is that hemoglobin is made up of 4 chains. It has 2 alpha chains, which are denoted down here at the bottom, alpha 1 and alpha 2. And it's also got 2 beta chains, beta 1 and beta 2. And we will spend some time later on during this session talking very briefly about these 4 chains and their role in oxygen binding, or I should say oxygen loading and unloading. What we specifically want to pay attention to as of right now is these little yellow things. There's one. There's the second one is in the back there. Here's 3. And here is 4 again in the back. Those little 4 circles there represent the key to oxygen being carried throughout the body. And it is what we refer to as a heme group. And it's that heme group that will bind the oxygen. Each heme can go ahead and carry and is responsible for transporting 1 oxygen molecule. And when oxygen binds to that heme group, and then therefore binding to the hemoglobin as a whole, it is what we refer to as oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin is what this is called. Again, each hemoglobin molecule, or each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules. Each heme group is responsible for carrying 1 oxygen. And again, this is basically iron that is really doing the carrying, if you would. And so that is where the key to transporting oxygen comes from. Now, we're not quite done there with this, because there's a relationship, if you would, between the players here. Think of this as left side, right side. And on the left side, we have hemoglobin plus oxygen. And on the right side, we have oxyhemoglobin right here. And the question is, what happens between the two? How do we decide if we're going to create oxyhemoglobin versus creating hemoglobin and oxygen separately? In other words, we like to do this. What determines if we're going to do unloading of oxygen or loading of oxygen? And that's what it comes down to. And I want to put this in terms of what happens if oxygen concentrations increase. What happens if oxygen concentrations increase? Which way is this equation more likely to go? Is it more likely to go to the right towards loading and form that oxyhemoglobin, or is it more likely to go to the left where you're going to have disassociation, where the oxygen is going to leave the hemoglobin and diffuse into the tissue? And the answer is this equation is more likely to go in this direction, and it is less likely to go in this direction. And so when oxygen concentrations increase, hemoglobin is more likely to bound it to or load it to itself. And so it will be creating oxyhemoglobin. Just the opposite would be true. If we instead of loading or instead of increasing oxygen concentrations, what if oxygen concentrations fell? Which way would this equation then move? And of course, the answer to that is it will move primarily to the left. It will move primarily to the left in that area there. And so if oxygen concentrations fall within the body, hemoglobin is going to give up the oxygen. It's going to do what we call disassociate or unload the oxygen to free the oxygen so it can diffuse into the membranes. And we can look at this as something referred to as the percent of saturation of hemoglobin. How much oxygen is available and how much of that oxygen available is going to bind to the hemoglobin or load onto the hemoglobin. And again, this is all based on, it all comes down to, and these are reoccurring themes, this is nothing new, it is all based on pressure. It's all based on pressure and the number of available hemoglobin molecules. And that's what's going to determine who's going to bind to who and what percentage of it. There is a relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and the hemoglobin binding, and we can look at this graphically, and it is what we refer to as the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Again, the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And this really is a critical concept when we look at respiratory distress and how patients that are suffering from respiratory distress are impacted physiologically, is what this comes down to. Physiologically. And it can be explained using this graph. Now, I want to make sure that everyone is clear on this and that I didn't confuse anyone within the lecture when we were going over this. Along the bottom, we have partial pressures of oxygen. All right, we have the partial pressure of oxygen from 0 partial pressure of oxygen on up to 100 partial pressure of oxygen, and that's 100 millimeters of mercury. Going up and down the left side over here, we have percent of saturation of the oxyhemoglobin. So how much oxygen exactly is going to be bound onto the heme groups at a specific pressure in time. And I've got two main areas marked out here for you. I've got 100 millimeters of mercury marked out. And really, you all realize that for argument's sake, this here is really 104, not 100. Right? But the graph goes up to 100, so that's where we're going to leave it. And I've also marked out for you, just as a comparison, no other reason, just a comparison, resting a resting cell. All right, so the partial pressure of oxygen in a resting cell is 40 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of the alveoli is 104 millimeters of mercury. All right, so don't get that confused. That's the resting cell is simply there as a reference point. Right? It's simply there as a reference point. That's all it's there for. So let's get back to the graph here. At 100 millimeters of mercury, or at 104 millimeters of mercury, notice we are at 98% saturation. We are at 98% saturation. We're not at 100% saturation for our oxygen bound to our heme groups. We're only at 98%. So at 104 millimeters of mercury worth of pressure, partial pressure inside of the alveoli, we're at 98% saturation. In order for us to get to 100% saturation, in order for every single heme group in our body to be bound with an oxygen, we would have to increase. Now, I want you to get a hold of this. Right? We would have to increase our partial pressure of oxygen. We would have to increase that to 650 millimeters of mercury. We would have to increase the partial pressure within the alveoli of oxygen 6.5 times greater. And if we did that, we would be able to take that graph and basically bump it up to 100%. You would have to increase the pressure 6.5 times greater than the normal alveolar pressure in order to get a 2% increase in oxygen saturation. It won't happen. Your alveoli would rupture, burst, and explode if we ever did that to them. And so really, we say that you are at 100%, quote unquote, when you are at 104 alveolar partial pressure, even though it's only 98%. And notice this with this, and keep in mind, this here, and maybe I didn't make this clear. This graph here is the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, that is what you are looking at here. All right. Let's take the second point. At 95% saturation, your alveolar pressure has dropped to 80 millimeters of mercury. At 90% saturation, your alveolar pressure is down to 60 millimeters of mercury, partial pressure for oxygen. It is in and around this area, right here, actually, I don't want to lie to you. Isn't that nice of me? I don't want to lie to you. It is right around that 90% mark. 88, 89, 90, 91, where physicians get worried of respiratory distress when you're only at 90% saturation. Right? That is a partial pressure within the alveoli of 60 millimeters of mercury. The thing is, yes, it is possible to move down to partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury within the alveoli. It is possible to get to the point where your alveoli pressure is the same and equal to the resting cell membrane, to the resting cell partial pressure. Hemoglobin saturation when alveolar pressure is at 40 millimeters of mercury is 75%. So what that says is you've got a red blood cell. All four heme groups are bound. It passes by a cell that is resting. 40 millimeters of mercury. One oxygen is going to disassociate and you're at 75% saturation. That's what that is saying. All right. Now, if you held your breath, you duct taped your mouth, you duct taped your nose, there ain't no air coming in, that red blood cell would be able to circulate back to that exact same resting cell another 3 times before it was completely depleted. Right? The problem with that is you're continuously lowering the partial pressure. And when you lower that partial pressure, you force unloading. All right, and that maybe I should type that out for you. As partial pressure drops, unloading of oxygen occurs. As partial pressure increases, loading of oxygen occurs. And you can see the markers there. At the height of exercise, where's the height of exercise at? The height of exercise, you are pushing as far and as intense as your body will go. You're right there. You're down to 20 millimeters of mercury worth of pressure within that alveoli. You are sucking air so fast that you can't keep the pressure up, and so you're not binding or loading that oxygen like you should be. And so the percent of saturation drops down to 30%. That's the beauty of this. That is where this is going. Okay, that is where that is going. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, here's a little, and I'm going to count this as extra credit for you all. Here's where we're going with this. All right. If we say that hemoglobin is at max partial pressure, when it reaches 104% millimeters of mercury alveolar pressure, why then do we give athletes oxygen? Is there any value to it? Think about that in terms of loading and unloading oxygen and what we just went through with the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Think about that. Get back to me. It's worth 10 extra credit points on an exam, probably your next upcoming exam if you so wish. But think about that. Get that paper into me, and life will be good. Now, we've been picking on oxygen a lot. We don't want to neglect carbon dioxide. It gets its feelings hurt. And so we want to come back through here and spend a few minutes, not long, but a few minutes, talking about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide buildup in the body is not a good thing because what it does is it forces the pH to increase. And when we increase the pH within the body, we create something known as acidosis. And acidosis is not good because tissues don't like high acidic areas. And they tend to break down when the pH goes too high. And you can see what some of the issues that are caused as pH increases within the body. All right. So with that said, how does our body then go ahead and regulate this stuff? How does it transport it? How does it get it from point B back to point A so we can get rid of it? And the key is the simple fact that 90% of the carbon dioxide that is in our body gets diffused into the circulatory system and is removed through the circulatory system. How? a good chunk of it, about 70-75% of carbon dioxide that diffuses into your circulatory system is turned into bicarbonate. Now, bicarbonate's an interesting little creature because it serves as a buffer within the body. And by a buffer, we simply mean that it's going to neutralize anything that is going to be off whack so that it can go ahead and bring it back to center. All right, now, that's good. The other 20%, some of that's going to be taken care of by the bicarbonate ion, and it's going to neutralize it. In fact, that's going to be the majority of it. Or it can be diffused into the urinary system and gotten rid of that way. There's a number of different ways that mechanism can work. 5% of the CO2 gets bound to the hemoglobin, and we end up forming what we refer to as the carboaminohemoglobin molecule. The problem with that is this. Carboaminohemoglobin tends to lower the affinity. It tends to lower the affinity of red blood cells. It tends to lower the affinity of red blood cells within the body. And that's typically not a good thing because what happens is carbon dioxide will bind itself to those alpha and beta chains on the hemoglobin. And when it does that, it basically it alters the chemistry of that hemoglobin complex and blocks the heme groups that are found on that, and therefore kicks the oxygen off, basically, or doesn't allow new oxygen to load onto it. And so that's not something that we want. And so what it does is it lowers the pH, increases the amount of hydrogen ions, and it promotes unloading. And so when pH drops too low, oxygen tends to unload. And that's not something that we necessarily want to see. It's a shift within the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. It is something that we can relate back to one of the chemists known as Bohr, and he created something that is referred to as the Bohr effect. And the Bohr effect simply states that there is a relationship between, in this case, pH and pressure. There's also a relationship between temperature and pressure. And I want to just spend a few minutes looking at this graph. We can see that as pH drops, here's your lower pH scale. As pH drops, here normal is 7.4 pH, and so that blue line would give you that nice normal dissociation curve for oxygen under specific types of pressure. But when that pressure drops, that pH drops down to 7.2. All right, check this out. Let's drop a line right here at 60%. We're going to drop a line right in here at 60%. I'm going to try to make it as straight as I can. All right, there goes our line at 60%. At 60% partial pressure, look what happens to each of the percent of saturation for hemoglobin. All right, so for a pH of 7.2, it's at around 86% saturation. That's respiratory distress. All right, that is clearly respiratory distress. At normal, we're at that 90%, and that's what we expected. That's what we saw on the other graph, so that we expected that. At a pH of 7.6%, we see We see that the percent of saturation for hemoglobin is 95, 96%. That's with an elevated pH. Right? So as pH drops, disassociation of oxygen happens more easily than when pH is normal or when pH increases. And when we say increase, we mean becomes more base, or there is a less of a presence of hydrogen ions. When it decreases, there's more of a presence of hydrogen ions, and so that pH tends to drop and head towards the acidic range of things. And so kind of keep that relationship in mind as we move forward. We can do the same thing for temperature. Now, for temperature, just to make a stronger point or case, I'm going to drop this line down here at 20 millimeters of mercury. And so this here is full-blown respiration. The problem is that's full-blown respiration under normal pretense. Right? And we kind of know that when we hit, this is all in Celsius. I'm kind of off on my line a little bit, but you can get the picture there. At 20 millimeters of pressure, as the temperature increases, in other words, as we get warmer, we know that our muscles become more metabolically active, almost to the point of breaking down. And that's exactly as what we see right here. At 20 millimeters of mercury, partial pressure of 20 millimeters of mercury, look what the percent of saturation is at 43 degrees Celsius. And by the way, 43 degrees Celsius, it's up there someplace. I think it's around 95, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere around there. You're at about 21% saturation. All right, and that's low. All right, that's again full-blown workout. And so as your internal body temperature raises, that is what happens. Here's normal body temperature. This is at 98.6, 98.7. We see that at normal, at 20%, or at a partial pressure of 20, we see that our saturation is at 40. Right, now watch what happens. The colder we get, the less we're moving, the less metabolically active we are, the higher the percent of saturation is. Oxygen's not going anywhere. Respiration is really low. Metabolically, we're not doing much. Muscles definitely are not moving all that much. Percent of saturation of oxygen tends to increase in that case there. All right, and then there's one last little thing that I will throw at you, and then we'll call it a day. And that is, why do we rely on this bicarbonate ion? In other words, why do we take the CO2, put it into the blood, and have it react and become bicarbonate? Well, as I've already mentioned, it's twofold. One is because it provides another avenue for transport for carbon dioxide. It's another way to get rid of carbon dioxide, and it's a very effective way, because you got to look at what that use of that is. It's a buffer. When the acidity level gets too high, it reacts with the bicarbonate, and it neutralizes the acid, which then brings that pH back into balance. And so it is with that we conclude the respiratory system, and we also conclude this session of WIMBA. As always, review this. I would especially go back and review the diagrams that I showed you. You had about three different diagrams here. Review that. Make sure you understand that, and you can put that to some kind of practical use and application. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Let me know. Or jot it down and ask me during lecture. We can go through and we can answer it that way. Continue studying. You can pause these guys, rewind them, back it up, restart them, do whatever you need to do. Just make sure that you are studying and keeping on top of this. This is Professor Young, wishing you a good day, happy studying, and we'll see you again in lecture.